Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This is Tyler Scribner with the National Congress of American Indians. We are working through getting BIA representatives on the line as well as speaking capabilities. Who do we have on the line at this time?
Pueblo of Acoma.
Hello,
Harrison.
this is Courtney Pulant, Great Plains region.
Rick Harrison, Alaska region.
Gail Vini, BIA.
Thank you each for joining us this afternoon. Gail, do you know if Janine is still having issues with the line? Is there anything we can do for her?
Just got on, guys. Sorry about that. My computer was upgraded today, so we had to reinstall GoToMeeting all the way around, but I'm here.
It's funny how those upgrades always seem to just break stuff, right?
Yep, and they always do it at the perfect time, don't they?
Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you each for joining us again. My name is Tyler Scribner. I'm a policy analyst for the National Congress of American Indians. Joining me today will be presenters Janine Brooks of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Budget and Performance Management, as well as Raina Thiel of Thiel Strategies. Chairman Harrison, before we begin, would you like to say anything?
Yeah. I'd like also, I know that we're all very busy with our schedules, so I'd first like to thank everybody for taking the time to be part of this process. I believe this is one of two folds here today, and that one is to orientate new members and educate them on the process and what we do with our work dealing with TIPIC. Also, I think we would like any feedback on how we can improve this orientation and make it better for new members coming on so we can have a better flow of work when we actually come to the meetings. Thanks.
Thank you. And to that end, any comments or questions that you may have regarding improvements to this presentation and orientation session, please send those to me at tscribner@ncai.org. And I'd also like to mention once again that this webinar will be recorded and hosted on NCAI's TIPIC webpage for use by all current and new TIPIC members, as well as the general public. By participating in this webinar, you agree to NCAI's use of this webinar for educational purposes. Thank you very much, and I will pass it over to Raina at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Tyler, and thank you everybody for joining us today for this new member and current member refresher webinar. And just to give a little bit of background to folks who are on the call today, we did host a pretty substantial process over the past year, about a year and a half, where we looked very deeply at what we need to do within TIPIC to improve process, to ensure that everyone who is a member of TIPIC is able to voice their opinion and voice their position in an effective way. And so part of what we came away with were a set of recommendations, one of which is that we need to ensure that folks are oriented to the work of TIPIC at the beginning of their tenure serving the TIPIC. So this is part of that process. This is to ensure that whether you're a new member or you're a member who is sitting in for a little bit of a refresher, that you have at least a basic understanding of what the budget process is, and also that we walk you through what TIPIC is about, what TIPIC's role and responsibilities are, and also what BIA's role in this process as well. The federal budget process is very, very complex. I, for one, have worked on these issues for many years, and I'm always still learning and still kind of finding out things that I don't know. So it takes a while to kind of get a hold of the process and really be able to kind of engage in it. So hopefully this will give folks a really good foundation for going forward in your work with the TIPIC. And so what I'd like to start off with is this initial slide, which you see. The federal budget process is basically a 5-step process. So the first is the president submits a budget request to Congress. Lawmakers release their own budget plans and set overall spending levels with a budget resolution. House and Senate subcommittees set funding for each program through appropriations bills. House and Senate members come together to resolve differences in their appropriations bills, and the budget returns to the president for his signature or his veto. And so what I'd like to do is kind of walk through each of these different steps kind of one by one to ensure that we all have a good understanding of what we're talking about here. And the first is the president's budget, which we will walk through. Okay. So despite being just one of the 5 steps in this process, the president's annual budget request to Congress has an entire process behind it, which is pretty complex. And so this diagram tries to kind of boil it down a little bit so folks can get a visual representation of what this looks like. But basically what you have is each of the agencies will kind of brainstorm and come up with their own recommendations about the budget levels that they would like to see requested to Congress. And those are then sent to the Office of Management and Budget, which is the President's budget office within the White House. And from there, they basically look over the requests from each of the agencies and push that forward to the Congress ultimately. So this is just kind of a brief snapshot of what some of that process looks like. And it's important to understand some of the key terms that we're talking about here. So I wanted to kind of walk through a few of these, and some of you may be aware of and familiar with some of these terms, others may not. But appropriations is one of the most important pieces of this puzzle. Appropriations are the annual funding decisions made by Congress about how the federal government spends at least some of its money, the discretionary part of its money. In general, the appropriations process addresses the discretionary portion, which is what they have control over in terms of recommendations and ultimately appropriations. And mandatory funding such as Medicare, Social Security, et cetera, is not included in that process. Appropriations Act is the act passed by Congress that sets funding levels for the federal government. So the Appropriations Acts are generally passed annually and provide funding authority that expires at the end of the federal fiscal year. Continuing resolution. So this is one that folks may hear pop up because it seems like we have these basically every year because the Congress does not usually pass an appropriations bill before the end of the fiscal year. And so a continuing resolution is often referred to as a CR, is a temporary bill that continues funding for all programs typically based on the most recent funding levels. They'll just kind of continue that for a specific amount of time, whether that's a few weeks or a month, whatever amount of time they think they need, so they can get through the appropriations process and pass full appropriations bills. Conference refers to members of the House and Senate who come together to reconcile their differences if they have 2 different bills. So for instance, if the House and Senate both pass appropriations bills that are similar but have some differences, they'll usually go to conference. And in that conference, they will kind of have a negotiation and go back and forth until they've resolved those differences and have an identical bill that each of them can send forward. The fiscal year. So the fiscal year, this is an important one here, runs from October 1st through September 30th every year. So as I was talking about that continuing resolution, if the Congress does not pass a full appropriations bill to fund the government by the end of the fiscal year, so by September 30th every year, that necessitates that they pass a continuing resolution. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where we have a shutdown or we have a lack of funding for the federal government. Budget authority. Budget authority is the federal government's legal authority to spend a given amount of money for a certain purpose. And this is according to the laws that are passed by the Congress and signed by the President. Obligations. So obligations are the financial commitments entered into by the federal government and federal officials using money that has been appropriated by the Congress and apportioned by the Office of Management and Budget. So for instance, if the General Services Administration had a contract with a construction company to build a new federal building, once they sign that contract, that money is considered to be obligated for that purpose. Apportionment, this is one that gets a little bit into the weeds, so it's one that you probably won't come across as often, but an apportionment is the OMB's legal authority to release funds that have been appropriated by the Congress to federal agencies for legally authorized purposes. And outlays are money paid by the U.S. Treasury when obligations are actually paid off. So basically when that GSA contract, it's already been signed, but when that money is transferred to the construction company, that is considered the outlay of those federal monies. So where does the federal government get its money? The answer is generally taxes. So in terms of tax revenue, the government raises trillions of dollars in tax revenue each year, and that's through a variety of different taxes and a variety of different fees. Some taxes fund specific government programs, while other taxes fund the government in general. When all taxes for a given year are not sufficient to cover all of the expenses that the government has incurred, which has been the case in much of the past 50 years, about 45 of the past 50 years, the U.S. Treasury borrows money to make up the difference. So in 2015, for instance, total federal revenues in that fiscal year were $3.18 trillion. And these revenues came from three major sources. The first is income taxes paid by individuals. So individuals like you and me, that was $1.48 trillion, or 47% of all tax revenues. The second is payroll taxes paid jointly by workers and employers, $1.07 trillion. And corporate income taxes paid by businesses, which was about $341.7 billion. And you can see in this pie chart kind of the breakdown of where the money the federal government raises is coming from. You can see it kind of broken down in these different kinds of taxes, excise taxes, customs, duties, kind of the smaller portions of the federal government's budget. So in terms of spending revenues and the deficit, I kind of explained how we get to that deficit number. Basically, when the federal government cannot raise enough via taxes to fund all of their activities, they will have to borrow the rest of that money, which puts us into a deficit. And so we hear a lot about this, about the deficit of the federal government. That's really where that is coming from. And so you can see in this graph of 2016 where the outlays are, and we talked about outlays being the actual money the federal government spends. And so that's the blue bar on the left, the darker blue bar. The bar on the right is the revenue that the federal government brought in via taxes. And then you see on the top that we did not raise enough money to cover all of those outlays, so that $0.6 trillion ends up as a deficit. And if anybody has any questions as we go along in this presentation, please feel free to ask your question, to interrupt if you would like to. Otherwise, we'll just keep on continuing with our presentation. So I talked about the federal budget process being a bit complicated. And I'll show you a couple of different tables here which kind of give you a sense for what we're talking about. And one of the reasons that the federal budget process is so complicated is because you have to do a lot of planning in the years before a fiscal year actually arrives. And so you can see here that, you take a couple years back, and then in 2017, you're working on your 2019 budget process, because that's the way that our process works. There's a lot of work that goes into building out what our recommendations are going to be. And so starting early, so the Congress has time to hopefully enact the levels that the president recommends, is why we have to start the budgeting process so early. And one of the things that folks are often frustrated by because of this very elongated budgeting process is that it's really hard to know what your priorities will need to be when you're budgeting so far out. And so folks often, have to appropriate in the Congress for emergency funding when there are emergencies that take place, domestically or internationally, because we have a pretty inflexible tool here when it comes to developing and ultimately appropriating the federal budget. In this one here, I like this table a little bit better, and it's just a bit more of a colorful representation of what we're talking about here. But you can see on the bottom, calendar year 2015, calendar year 2016, and calendar year 2017. And anybody who has just joined, we're just going through the budget process as it currently exists and how it's supposed to function, although I should qualify this by letting folks know that this, despite being the process that is usually or is supposed to be followed, sometimes it can deviate from what we see here. So on the very bottom, you see the calendar years, and on the top left, you can see that we have the fiscal years listed out there. So in calendar year 2015, for instance, on the bottom there, you can see that there is something happening with fiscal year 2016, fiscal year 2017 budget, and fiscal year 2018's budget. And so that's a 3-year budgeting cycle. So you have these different stages of each of those budgets that is happening simultaneously, either with the executive branch or with the Congress. And so that's what makes this process a little bit complicated, is understanding, okay, which fiscal year are we working on, which fiscal year are we developing recommendations for, because there is activity happening for each of these different fiscal year budgets. So we're back to our 5-step process, and we just covered the president's budget, or we're going to cover a little bit more of the president's budget actually here. And so the president's budget request, as we stated before, this goes forward to the Congress as recommendations of what the president wants to see for each of the federal agencies in the fiscal year that he's submitting. And a lot of folks, when they see the president's budget, they think that those are the levels that are ultimately appropriated and able to be used by the different federal agencies for their programs, but that's not always the case. In fact, it's often not the case. What tends to happen is that the president will submit his budget recommendations to the Congress, and then the Congress has control over the purse strings and are ultimately in charge of what levels of funding the agencies will receive. But every year, despite whether or not the Congress will or will not follow his recommendations, each year the president is required to submit their budget recommendation levels to the Congress. And the formulation of the president's budget, that starts pretty early, and it marks the beginning of the annual budget process, and it begins really within the federal agencies. And the budget request itself is developed through a pretty interactive process between the agencies and the President's Office of Management and Budget. And I mentioned OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, before, but they're basically responsible for collecting all the requests from the agencies and ensuring that whatever they're ultimately recommending is in alignment with whatever the President's priorities are. So they will have specific guidance internally, which tells them, okay, here's our top line budget level that we cannot exceed, and here are the things that the president really cares about and really wants to see funded in his budget. And so then they can kind of take funds from certain locations and switch them if they need to, just to ensure that they're meeting the president's requirements. The president's budget that he submits to Congress generally outlines 3 primary recommendations. The first is how much money the federal government should spend on public purposes. The second is how much should it take in as tax revenues, so how much are they taxing Americans, and how much of a deficit or surplus, right now a deficit, the federal government should run, which is simply the difference between the first and the second point there. And in most years, spending does exceed tax revenues, as we talked about, and the resulting deficit is financed through borrowing. The development of the president's budget, this is a pretty long process, and as I stated, this marks really the beginning of the budget process, for a specific fiscal year. And so that really begins in the springtime when federal agencies begin to look internally at their programs and begin to formulate what their recommendations for each of their line item programs should be. And that's based around several different considerations, including guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, which oftentimes is supposed to arrive around the same time, although I've seen guidance from OMB go to the agencies much later, depending on what is happening and what the guidance is for. On September 7th is when the agencies submit their recommendations for their own budgets to the Office of Management and Budget. And from September to October, OMB works to basically reconcile what the agencies have requested with what the President's priorities are. And so we won't always see perfect alignment here. What we're going to see is that some agencies request at higher or lower levels than the President would like vis-a-vis his priorities. And so during that period, OMB works with the agencies and also works with other parts of the White House to ensure that they're reflecting properly whatever the President's priorities might be. October through December is what we call Passback. And so OMB, once they have the agency's recommended levels, they will look at those, they will revise them as they see fit and as the President desires. Once they have finished those revisions, those will go back to the agencies for Passback and ultimately for finalization once the agencies respond to those different levels of funding. In January, agencies and OMB develop budget justifications for Congress. So this goes beyond the budget numbers. This really kind of tells the Congress what is behind those budget numbers. So what does that actually represent? If there is an increase that's being requested for a specific program, in the budget justification is where you would find information about what that increase is for. And in February, you have publication of the budget and the submission of that budget to Congress for their consideration. So in the spring, every federal agency must consider how to prioritize their funding within their department. This process is for the budget, which is 2 years out, as I mentioned, which can be a challenge because you don't know what's going to be happening in 2 years, generally speaking. And so part of this is really kind of a guessing game in terms of what you're going to budget for a couple of years out. And every agency approaches this process a little bit differently, but most often the head of each agency will ask every program and bureau to develop their individual funding requests within some set of guidelines. So perhaps that guideline is a 5% increase, perhaps that guideline is a 5% decrease, and then they have to kind of peg that to some number. And so if there is not a finalized appropriations bill for that year, you could peg it to the most recent enacted amounts from a continuing resolution, for instance. So the agencies. So generally speaking, as we saw in our previous chart, in the spring, OMB usually will issue guidance to the federal agencies based on the President's priorities, and it will also lay out guidelines for each federal agency's budget request to OMB. Each agency head takes this guidance into account and really decides how to apply it to the programs within their department, and also how to reconcile the OMB guidance with any other guidance the department has already issued internally. And so here you have a photo of the current Secretary of the Interior, David Bernhardt, and he would be the one, his office would be the one to receive this guidance from OMB and to ensure that their agency is in compliance, but also to decide, if there is a cut that's recommended within the OMB guidance, it's up to them to decide how they're going to distribute that cut or distribute an increase vis-a-vis that guidance. And this is just a little diagram of what the structure of Department of the Interior looks like, including some of the current relevant leadership that we have at the helm. As I mentioned, Secretary David Bernhardt is the current cabinet head. we have Associate Deputy Secretary Jim Kaysen, and we also have Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Tara Sweeney. So what does BIA consider when formulating their budget requests? And this goes for agencies in general. There are several things that must be considered when formulating a budget request, especially for tribal nations. The first is, what do tribal nations prioritize themselves? So what are the things that they believe are most important for their communities? And this is based on TIBIC's final priorities report and input from the TIBIC budget subcommittee, which is an exercise that we go through each year to determine what tribes' priorities are. What programs have been measurably successful? This is a big one that OMB cares very deeply about, is what does the data say about how successful these federal programs have been? And where should we invest additional resources versus where should we invest fewer resources? What programs have been unsuccessful? What programs are mandated by law? And what pressing issues and presidential priorities need to be addressed, and how should those be addressed? So, for instance, funding to combat something like the opioid crisis, which right now is receiving a lot of attention and has become a major issue nationwide. And so this is a breakdown of what the basics of the process look like. BIA makes recommendations in consultation with TIBIC's budget subcommittee and finalizes with the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. Asia negotiates the budget request with the Secretary of the Interior, and Asia and Secretary of the Interior agree on a budget request, which is then consolidated into a department-wide document with all of DOI's other bureaus and offices, and ultimately that's sent over to OMB by September 7th, at which time they begin their review process. So developing the President's Budget, Step 2, and this goes over OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is, despite the responsibilities that it has, which are very important in the White House and in the federal government, it's really a pretty poorly understood agency. And if folks have heard of it, they have heard very little about kind of what happens there. But I'll try to go through a little bit of what does occur in that organization. I worked there for about 5 years, so I can give you some of this inside scoop here. But OMB stands for the Office of Management and Budget, and it's the White House's office tasked with negotiating and ultimately assembling the President's budget recommendations to Congress. And so it's within the Executive Office of the President, within the White House, and it's a fairly large office for the White House, and it's primarily permanent staff. And when I say permanent staff, those are civil servants, so basically folks who, if they would like, can stay in their positions for the long term. But there are also folks who are known as appointees or presidential appointees, and that's what we're looking at here. This circled section are the folks who serve as the presidential appointees for OMB. So it's a pretty small number of folks who are presidentially appointed in OMB, and then under each of the resource management offices down below there, we'll talk about those in a minute, but those are kind of where a lot of the real work happens within the department in terms of analyzing budget requests and ultimately recommending the president's budget levels. So for instance, Mick Mulvaney, who's the current OMB director, is a presidential appointee, meaning that his tenure, as I stated before, is basically as though he were a contractor contracted with the president's administration for the term of the president's position in office. So they are most often not long-term employees, and their terms last generally until a new president takes office. Here's just a little snapshot of these staff appointments. within OMB. And then below that level of director, we have the resource management offices. And BIA, and the entire Department of the Interior, resides in the circle on the bottom left of your screen within the Natural Resources Program Resource Management Office. And so all of these offices are filled with folks who are career or civil servant staff, so the long-term staff. And those long-term staff are referred to as budget examiners. And those budget examiners are the ones who are each assigned either an agency or a subset of different bureaus within an agency as part of their portfolio. And we try to, they're trying to basically balance out the budget numbers for each portfolio among the different examiners. And that person is responsible for receiving the recommendations that the agencies put forward to OMB, and also helping to reconcile those budget numbers with the president's priorities and the priorities of the presidential appointees. So what does OMB do with DOI's budget requests? So once DOI sends OMB their budget request on September 7th, DOI will generally, and this is not always a hard and fast rule, but generally the agencies will not be entirely privy to OMB's review process for a couple of months. So mostly the OMB will meet with the agencies. They will ask for additional information about why they requested the levels that they did, but it won't really be a two-way communication channel, generally speaking. OMB kind of does their analysis and their work within their individual agency. And when they receive those recommendations from Department of the Interior, those are split up into different parts depending on which examiners have the different bureaus within the department. So, for instance, Fish and Wildlife Service will go to a different person than the BIA budget will go to. So entirely different offices and different examiners. Next, OMB's budget examiners receive the request, and they basically conduct a process which in the beginning is about a 3-week to 1-month process of kind of meeting with the agency, trying to understand the details of the request, understanding why certain budget line items are perhaps greater or decreased in the most recent budget request. The examiners then formulate an updated resource request, which is aligned with the President's budget priorities, but which also takes into account the levels that the agencies have requested. So once OMB examiners have finished their budget recommendations, they go through an internal process which concludes with what is referred to as director's review. And so this is generally what happens if there are any major increases or decreases being recommended for a specific program, or if there is a change in policy which is being proposed, which needs to be reviewed. So that could be the creation of a new line item, the creation of a new program, things of that nature would be included as part of the director's review. They would present those recommendations directly to the OMB director, Mick Mulvaney, who would then be the ultimate decision maker on whether or not those recommendations should go forward. Then we come to Passback. So once OMB has gone through their process, once they have reconciled what the agencies have requested with what the President's priorities are, OMB will then send back those recommendations to the agencies in a process known as Passback. And OMB and DOI at this point, if they disagree on the revised budget numbers that OMB has suggested back to DOI, OMB and DOI will conduct a very high-level negotiation to basically reconcile the agency request and the OMB response. Generally in this process, you could even consider it kind of an appeals process, but generally it doesn't impact the ultimate numbers that go forward very much. Once OMB has passed back their recommendations, it can be a little bit difficult to try to negotiate for a different outcome. But folks do try it every cycle, because if their recommendations aren't matching up, that's just part of the process. So the third step in developing the president's budget, once we've gotten through Passback, once the appeals process has gone forward and has been resolved, then OMB examiners assemble all of their recommendations into what's known as the president's budget request. And that includes requests for every single federal government program. And finally, the president delivers his budget proposal to the Congress, generally the first Monday of February. And that date, that is usually a hard and fast date, although sometimes in extenuating circumstances, that timeline gets shifted a little bit. And so here we see the president's budget from, I believe that was 2017. And that is basically what you see that is delivered to the Congress from OMB. And it's just these massive numbers of very, very large books. And of course, the digital version is also delivered to the appropriate congressional offices. So what happens once the president delivers the budget to the Congress? His budget request, I should say, to the Congress. So then then we enter into the congressional budget process, which is an entirely separate process from the president's budget recommendations that we talked about. And we'll go through a little bit of what that looks like. And again, kind of like similar to the executive branch budget recommendations process, this process is also pretty complicated and can take a lot of time, especially if there is a lot of disagreement in the Congress about the direction of the federal budget. So in the 5-step federal budget process, we're now in step 2, which is lawmakers release their own budget plans and set overall spending levels with a budget resolution. So a budget resolution, after the president delivers his recommendations, the House and the Senate budget committees spring into action, in theory, is what should happen, and they should agree on a budget resolution which sets the total overall spending and taxation levels for the fiscal year being considered. The budget levels set out by the resolution are not signed by the president. This is purely a congressional resolution, and they do not have the force of law. However, they are binding. Those levels are binding to the 2 houses of Congress and will limit the amount of funding that can be appropriated through the following appropriations process. So this is a little snapshot of what we're talking about here. We have the introduction of an appropriations bill, which is happening in the triangles that you see in the square in the middle of the photo. And then you also have the budget committee, which is doing their work a little bit separately, but which ultimately will cap the appropriations levels that the Congress can consider. And this is just an example of what we're talking about when we say spending cap. Fundamentally, the budget resolution is structured along about 20 different what are called budget functions or categories of spending. So for instance, for national defense, the function is number 050. And in 2005, you can see as an example, their spending cap was 423, I believe that's billion, I'm not sure. But that's their cap there on the right for 2005. And you can go down the list here and see every different functional area has a different cap that they cannot exceed when appropriations are being delivered by the other parts of the Congress. So step 3 in our 5-step federal budget process is House and Senate subcommittees set funding for each program through the appropriations bills. So after the president submits the budget and the House and the Senate agree on a budget resolution setting those overall levels we talked about, the appropriations subcommittees in both the House and the Senate will hold hearings on the segments of the budget under their jurisdiction. So these are split up along different subject areas, and each subcommittee of the appropriations committees will have a section of the federal budget they're responsible for. And they'll focus on the details of the agency's justifications, which provide those kind of supporting materials for their budget requests. And each of these subcommittees then introduces an appropriations bill, which is relevant to their area of jurisdiction, and conduct some hearings and other informational studies. At hearings at which primarily agency officials testify, they may also be supplemented by meetings and communications between subcommittee staff and agency officials. At the same time, the subcommittees may solicit requests from members of Congress for programmatic levels and language that they want included in that appropriations bill and in the committee report. After conducting hearings, the House and Senate appropriations committees will make their suballocations, and the subcommittees begin to draft, mark up, which means to edit, and report, which means to basically approve those appropriations bills out of their committee, the regular bills under their jurisdiction to their respective full committees. And as I talked about, markup is the process by which the congressional committees and the subcommittees amend a bill that they have under their jurisdiction. And the reporting of the bill basically means the subcommittee has approved the bill and that they've approved it to pass to the full committee for their consideration. So you can see here the annual federal budget process, and this is going back to that original diagram that I showed you, which has the president's budget request process on the top there in a very, very simplified version. In the middle here is the House and the Senate's process. Okay. Go back to one more step. So the fourth step here in our 5-step budget process is when the House and the Senate come together to resolve their differences in their appropriations bills. So once we go through the budget resolution process, check, then we go through our appropriations subcommittee and full committee markup, and those bills are reported out. They'll then go to the House and the Senate floor for approval. And once that has happened, you can see that last piece there on the right in that middle diagram is when the House and Senate, if they do not have identical bills, will go to conference. So the Constitution is what requires the House and Senate to approve the same measure in precisely the same form before it can be presented to the President for his signature or his veto. So once the House and Senate have completed their initial consideration of an appropriations measure, the committees in each chamber will at least attempt to negotiate a resolution of those differences between their respective versions. And this can be a pretty difficult process depending on how different the two parties consider the changes that are in the other House's version of the bill. And so generally what the practice has been is to convene a conference committee which seeks to resolve those differences and ultimately produce the same appropriations bill that can then be sent to the President. So in the way it's currently practiced, the Senate will typically pass the House bill with the Senate version attached as what is called a substitute amendment. So basically, they attach a different bill and say, okay, we're substituting the bill that you gave us, House, with this bill that we actually want. And members of the House and Senate appropriations have committees having jurisdiction over a particular appropriations bill, as well as the chair and ranking minority members of the full committees are designated generally as the conferees, or the folks who are tasked with that negotiation over the two different versions of the House and Senate bill. And so they will ultimately, they'll sit in a room together and basically kind of hash out the differences in the bills and decide how to come to a middle ground, which gets them an identical bill. And as I stated, the completion of that conference report is really not on a specified timeline. So, you know, once negotiations like basically conclude when they conclude. And once that agreement has been hopefully reached, they report the conference report, which proposes a new substitute for the previous bills as a whole. And so that substitute for the House and the Senate will be the identical bills, which will then have to go to the President for his signature. So typically the House will consider conference reports on appropriations measures first, and they'll have to approve that conference report, which is that appropriations bill which came out of the negotiations process we just talked about. And so those should be the two identical bills that the House and the Senate have agreed upon. And so like once it's brought back to the House, they can adopt it, which is the hope of the conference committee. They can reject it, or they can recommit it to the conference for further consideration. And if the House adopts the conference report, the conference is disbanded, and the second House has two options: to adopt or to reject the conference report. And that, of course, that second House would be the Senate. And in cases where the conference report is either rejected or recommitted to the conference, the two chambers can negotiate further over the matters that they're in disagreement about. However, the President cannot be sent the measure until both the House and the Senate have agreed to the same bill. All right, so the fifth step is the budget returns to the President for his signature before it becomes the law. So under the Constitution, after a measure is presented to the President, he has 10 days to either sign or to veto the measure. If he takes no action, the bill automatically becomes law at the end of that period. However, if he takes no action and the Congress is adjourned, that is actually considered a veto. So it's what is generally referred to as a pocket veto. And if the President vetoes the bill, he's basically sending it back to the Congress, and they have to come up with 2/3 votes in both the House and the Senate in order to override that veto. And if the President does sign the bill, then the appropriations is now law. That's some nice little animations there. So now I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Tyler from NCAI, who's going to go through what TIBIC is and its role. And folks will notice that we probably say TIBIC differently. I say TIBIC, I think, Tyler, you say TIBIC. Either is totally fine, just different ways of pronouncing it. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Tyler.
Thank you, Raina. It all depends on which part of Indian country you're from, I guess. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Raina, as well. About TIBIC, the Tribal Interior Budget Council, previously the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Budget Advisory Council, or TBAC, was established in 1999 to facilitate tribal government participation in the planning of BIA budget, and includes 2 tribal representatives from each of the 12 BIA regions, as well as a number of federal officials. TIPIC's mission is to provide an advisory government-to-government forum and process for tribal nations and the Department of the Interior to develop budgets that allow for the fulfillment of tribal nations' self-determination, self-governance, sovereignty, and treaty rights through program funding levels that address the obligations of the federal government to tribal nations and their citizens. At this time, I would like to pause for a brief moment and request that either of the TIBIC tribal co-chairs speak a bit about the history and creation of TIBIC.
This is Ron. Am I live?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Is Rick on the line too?
Yes, he is.
I am, but I wasn't around for the creation of
All right. Well, let me just start, and then Rick can chime in. As Tyler just said, it was started back in 1999. Actually, I thought it was 96, but 99 works for me. I've been on it ever since, coming from the Northwest. back then, we were very concerned that the Bureau did not engage with the tribes in a meaningful way with regard to its priorities, that they took whatever process they were using for many, many years to identify what the priorities are, collaborating with the regional directors, et cetera, to identify what those needs are. And so as a result, this TIBIC Advisory Council got established and allowed us to start having more meaningful input on those priorities nationally and regionally, and often tribal specific, so that we can advocate for it. I have found it is a process that is important because it does allow us to, or it does require us to collaborate with the tribes in our respective region. We've had different successes and failures, if you will, on that particular process that we continue to try to improve. But at least we're able to identify the regional specific priorities that are in the process. I think that I really have high appreciation for Raina's presentation on the big picture, how it works. Often we have had people come into our forum thinking that they're talking about IHS stuff as well, and so often many of our tribal leaders don't know that TIBIC only deals with the BIA and OST, Office of Special Trustee, and the other agencies, as we're able to have input on the other interior agencies. But over the years, we have insisted on collaborating with the budget folks for interior and for all of interior, not just the BIA, so we know where we stand in that forum. We've also done a good job, I think, of getting the OMB over and listening in on the challenges that we have had over the years. So it has had some impact, and I think that many who don't participate don't know exactly how the impact has made a difference, because we've not had a very good reporting system on what was the final outcome of our recommendations and prioritization versus what was the end result, both from the perspective of what the department advocated in the president's budget, but also what Congress eventually appropriated, to know how you can match up the needs and ask of the tribes. And I really do think that, I'm not sure exactly where we are, Tyler and Raina, on the current system, but we've now started shifting the process so that it's more transparent and more inclusive of all different priorities and areas of needs in the 12 regions. It is unique in that some areas of the budget are area specific. They may be Northwest, maybe Midwest, Great Lakes, or Southwest, etc. So it's hard dealing with the needs of the tribes, and because of the Raina's point about they have a working budget cap that they have to work under, or some criteria that may be you can ask for no more than 5% increase, or whatever the number is that we're working with. I will do a footnote that in the past they had asked us to also identify if we had to cut by 3%, 5%, or whatever, where would you take the cut? And the tribes have consistently not participated in it. And when we did, we primarily focused in on the department federal programs, meaning the actual executive budget areas, et cetera. And then I also want to note that there are areas in the budget that are relative to settlement And a lot of tribal leaders for over the past number of years have said that they think that really should be a Department of Justice responsibility and fiscal responsibility, and not Department of Interior, and should make room for more of the priorities of the tribes, which is an ongoing challenge for Indian country. So I would leave it at that. I've always felt that we have done a pretty good job of working the Hill while we work within the system, knowing that TIPIC is primarily an advisory for the executive branch, and that we have to circle back to the legislative branch to try to get a fair shake out of the budget process. I'll stop there. There's lots more to this process, but for me, in my perspective, activism and understanding the system has always been a critical issue for tribal leaders to make sure that we're using this process in an effective way. So I'll turn it over to you, Rick.
Thanks, Ron. I think you did a really good job. The only thing I would add to that is when Ron talked about participation and people maybe not being aware of, the process because they're not participating, I don't think that's just our tribal leaders across the country, but it's also our TIPIC members. I think that's one of the most important things for this body to be efficient and effective is all of our participation at every meeting. We get bogged down with things when people aren't there, and then they come in and we have to rehash things and go over things over and over again because people miss meetings. And I understand we all have busy schedules, but we set these meetings dates out way in advance, and we need to really try to work hard as a body to make sure we're at those meetings or have representation at those meetings that can articulate the conversation back to the main member. But that said, I think with everybody's participation, I think that we can be a much more effective and efficient force for Indian country. Thank you.
Thank you each very much.
If I might add just a little bit more, sometimes we do get just sideways on unique challenges that tribes have, and I'm specifically referencing large tribe, small tribe, large land base, small land base perspective. There is no question that they are very different in their needs because of the size of the tribe or the magnitude of their reservation responsibilities, etc. But what we don't do very well is take the time to do an analysis to show that it is fairly well balanced, but we have a responsibility to all 573 Indian nations, and so that's a very challenging balance to maintain, to make sure that everyone's getting a quote unquote a fair shake out of the budget process.
Thank you each very much. And to the extent that the tribal budget formulation process has changed for TIPIC, Janine Brooks of the Bureau of Indian Affairs will be speaking to that after my piece. Thank you each very much. TIPIC provides a forum and process consistent with Public Law 93-638, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, also referred to as ISDA of 1975, Section 450A1, as well as Executive Order 13175 and the Department of Interior's government-to-government policy, whereby tribal nations and DOI work together to develop policies and budgets that ensure DOI is able to fulfill its trust responsibilities and treaty obligations to tribal nations, and to secure funding levels to ensure that secure funding levels are provided to tribal nations to strengthen tribal governance capacity, including the fulfillment of tribal nations' inherent sovereign rights of self-determination, self-governance, and self-sufficiency. TIPIC's roles and responsibilities. Tribal representatives will advise and make recommendations to DOI and Indian Affairs on the development of Indian programs within DOI as they relate to the priority needs of tribal governments and individual American Indian and Alaskan Native beneficiaries, on strategic planning and data collection processes and systems to justify budget proposals to meet unmet obligations to fully fund budget priorities, to support budget formulation, fund distribution, program management, and statutory and regulatory reporting requirements, including Government Performance and Results Act, also known as GPRA measures, and program assessments as they apply to the federal and tribal systems. To also provide and make recommendations on policy and performance measure changes that improve the budgeting policy for the long term, including development of standards and criteria for GPRA, program assessments, and DOI strategic plan measures, on the establishment of meaningful and effective relationships and communications with all federal officials that influence the Indian Affairs and OST budgets, including the Office of Management and Budget and the White House, and will advise and make recommendations to facilitate a coordinated budget strategy for tribal programs that includes all federal agencies and stakeholders. So over the past year, a TIPIC protocol document has been developed. The TIPIC protocol lays out the history and rules governing TIPIC's membership, decision-making process, and roles. Selection criteria. Each region will establish a process to nominate and select 2 tribal officials to serve on TIPIC and a 3rd tribal official to serve as an alternate. Each region should ensure that all tribal nations located in that region have an opportunity to provide input on the nomination and selection process. There are 3 tribal co-chairs who are elected by a vote of the tribal membership of TIPIC. The chairs are elected in a manner that is representative of direct service, self-governance, and self-determination or 638 contracting for tribal nations. Tribal co-chairs serve 3-year terms. The election of the expired term tribal co-chair will be held annually at the TIPIC National Budget Meeting in March. Here's 3 wonderful photos of your current tribal co-chairs.
Leave them up, leave them up.
Please don't.
For those, well, this webinar will be posted on our website should you be interested in freeze framing that particular slide. The Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs serves as the federal co-chair, and the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, or PDOS, will serve in the Assistant Secretary Indian Affairs absence. Tribal representatives are appointed for 2-year terms. Tribal representatives may be appointed for multiple terms. In the event that a TIPIC member can no longer serve on TIPIC or cannot meet attendance requirements, the BIA Regional Director shall, in consultation with tribal nations in their BIA region, appoint a new tribal representative to complete their current term. Tribal representatives serving on TIPIC and BIA regional offices are responsible for coordinating input from other tribal leaders within their respective regions, as well as providing a report of recommendations and actions from TIPIC to their respective regions. Tribal representatives, the National Congress of American Indians, and BIA regional directors should work together to ensure that tribal representatives have an opportunity to present updates to relevant intertribal gatherings in their region prior to and at the end of the budget formulation process. DOI Indian Affairs staff members serving on TIPIC are responsible for facilitating the active participation of tribal representatives in the formulation of the Indian Affairs budget request and annual performance plan. Federal partners at Indian Affairs, in conjunction with TIPIC tribal co-chairs, will develop a draft agenda and send it to TIPIC members no later than 30 calendar days before the next TIPIC meeting. TIPIC co-chairs will also moderate TIPIC meetings, appoint subcommittee chairs or co-chairs, and ensure TIPIC objectives are acted upon. TIPIC tribal representatives should make every effort to participate in all in-person and webinar or phone TIPIC meetings. Each representative can backfill their participation at in-person or remote TIPIC meetings with their alternate representative once per budget formulation cycle, except in extenuating circumstances conveyed to and approved by the TIPIC tribal co-chairs. This attendance standard will ensure that regional representatives at each meeting are up to date and actively engaged in the work of TIPIC. TIPIC meetings are typically held over 2 or 3 consecutive days unless otherwise agreed to. These meetings are open to the public, however, only TIPIC members are eligible to bring motions and vote. All tribal leaders are welcome to attend any tribal caucus during TIPIC meetings and address matters of interest. Any co-chair may recognize non-TIPIC members in discussions during meetings. However, priority shall be given to TIPIC members before a non-member is given the opportunity to discuss the issue. TIPIC representatives will be reimbursed for attendance through their BIA regional office in a manner that's acceptable to the TIPIC representative. Voting. A quorum is the minimum number of members that must be present at any meeting to make the proceedings of that meeting valid. For TIPIC on quorum and voting, a quorum will be met by 3/4, 18 people, a majority of the voting tribal representatives, or 3/4 of tribal regions representing all of the BIA regions. In the absence of a quorum, a working meeting will be held with no formal actions. Voting is limited to TIPIC tribal representatives or their designee. In order for an action or motion to pass, the action or motion being considered requires a simple majority of TIPIC representatives present. TIPIC may establish subcommittees at any time to review, investigate, and/or evaluate issues of importance and provide recommendations to TIPIC. TIPIC must establish a clear mission, purpose, and objectives and/or tasks for the subcommittee and select 5 members, including 1 or 2 chairs, to serve on the subcommittee. The proposed subcommittee must be approved by the full TIPIC body before the subcommittee is authorized to begin its mission. A quorum for a TIPIC subcommittee is 3 of its 5 members. Only the 5 full members of a subcommittee can vote. However, subcommittee meetings are also open to the public and for attendance and participation by full TIPIC membership. Subcommittee chairs will be responsible for working with the full TIPIC to fill vacant positions on subcommittees. TIPIC will approve any proposed changes to subcommittee membership at its next meeting. Proposed new members may participate in subcommittee meetings in a non-voting capacity until their official membership is approved. TIPIC tribal subcommittee members should make every effort to participate in all in-person and webinar or phone subcommittee meetings. Each representative can backfill their participation at in-person or remote TIPIC meetings with their alternate representative once per budget formulation cycle, except in extenuating circumstances conveyed to and approved by the subcommittee co-chairs. If a tribal subcommittee member is unable to meet their attendance obligation, the subcommittee chairs will work with the TIPIC co-chairs to identify and designate replacement members. Subcommittees are intended to operate for a duration specified by TIPIC at the subcommittee's inception. A subcommittee's term may be extended by a majority vote of the TIPIC. If no extension is granted, the subcommittee will be dissolved. Standing subcommittees may be established to address long-term or continuing issues. Subcommittee meetings are open to all TIPIC members. A standing subcommittee's continuation must be agreed to annually at the first national budget meeting of the calendar year. Each subcommittee leader will designate a single individual, either a technical advisor or other staff assistant, to act as logistical lead. Those responsibilities will be working with the chairs to schedule the subcommittee meetings, tracking meeting topics, discussions, outcomes, and follow-up items, working with the chairs to draft meeting agendas and circulate them to subcommittee membership 1 week in advance of meetings, tracking subcommittee membership, attendance, and managing a process to onboard new members. Working with the subcommittee chairs to draft talking points, meeting minutes, and other relevant documents, and ensuring the availability of relevant printed materials for each meeting. Each subcommittee will present to the full TIPIC only when there are specific decision items that require consideration by the TIPIC full body, unless delegated by the TIPIC full body. Here is a listing of the existing TIPIC subcommittees. You'll see the Education, Data Management, and Budget subcommittees are standing subcommittees, and that Law Enforcement and Road subcommittees are currently not standing subcommittees. Each subcommittee is assigned a chairperson. That chairperson and technical support staff maintain a current list of members of that subcommittee. In order to join a subcommittee, contact the current chairperson and they'll determine if there's space on the subcommittee for another voting member, and if so, we'll add you to the list. At the next full TIPIC meeting, the full TIPIC body will be made aware of the request and vote on adding you as a member of the subcommittee. Please note that all TIPIC members, regardless of membership on a specific subcommittee, can participate in any subcommittee meetings and/or discussions as a non-voting member. The Budget Subcommittee. The Budget Subcommittee is responsible for reviewing technical information on budget development and making recommendations to the full TIPIC for its review, possible amendment, and approval. Budget Subcommittee is comprised of a core group of 6 federal and 7 tribal TIPIC representatives that serve staggered 3-year terms. Tribal representatives are appointed by the tribal co-chairs, and federal officials are appointed by the ASIA. The ASIA is the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. The Budget Subcommittee will be chaired by one of the TIPIC co-chairs or a designee. The Data Management Subcommittee is tasked to identify national standards and benchmarks, analyze and provide recommendations to standardize the tribal data collection process, develop a data management policy for reporting and managing tribal data, establish the Office of Program and Data Quality for Indian Country. The Data Management Committee is comprised of 6 federal and 7 tribal representatives, which will serve staggered 3-year terms. Tribal representatives are appointed by the tribal co-chairs, and federal officials are appointed by the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. TIPIC has the authority to create and dissolve issue-based subcommittees. The TIPIC co-chairs appoint a subcommittee leader or co-leaders who is or are responsible for fulfilling the subcommittee mandate from TIPIC. A tribal co-chair will serve as a member of established standing subcommittees. If there are decision points or action items to review, each subcommittee must provide a report at the next TIPIC meeting following the subcommittee's convening on that decision point or action item.
Okay.
Tribal TIPIC members will speak on issues of general benefit to Indian country. It is assumed that tribal TIPIC members will speak from the experience of their tribal nation for the benefit of Indian country in general, and that no conflict of interest with any other tribal nation occurs when a member speaks about any tribal issues in their particular region. TIPIC members will not present proposals that create an unfair advantage over any other TIPIC member or tribal nation for that individual person, his or her personal office, or his or her tribal nation in the budget process. Thank you very much for being here with me through the TIPIC protocols. At this time, I would like to pass it over to Janine for a little bit about the budget priority ranking tool and how that process through BIA has changed.
Good afternoon, everybody. And is this turned over so I can move the screen, Tyler, or how does that work?
We were having issues with transferring the screen. If you'd like to just tell me next slide, I'm more than happy to walk that through for you.
All right, sounds good to me. Well, let's get started. All right, first of all, we have our budget timeline up here, formulation timeline. This is just an informational piece that will let you know every stage of the formulation process that we go through. A lot of this was outlined in what Raina has already given you. But this also gives you a little insight of where tribes can participate outside of just the TIPIC process. All of the little red lines is where tribes can provide input into the budget in the green book outside of just the ranking. And then the green arrows will show you if you're going to come in and meet with Congress or meet with OMB. It tells you the timelines of when they'll actually be looking at our budget submissions so you can help sway their thought process and when they go to provide our numbers and give us Passback. I'm not going to go through every little bit of this for you, as Raina has done most of it already, but it is a good informational tool. Okay, meeting schedule and purpose. TIPIC and Indian Affairs meet in person. We meet 3 times a year. It was formerly 4 times a year. We have decided that's too much to do, and we have merged our March and May meetings. We now meet either late March and early April. We start out the year with November. In November, after the first school year starts, we're pretty much doing the kickoff of what's coming up for the formulation process for the year. That's where we have just rolled out our ranking tools and our guidance for formulation. So that is an important meeting so we can have those kinds of discussions on any changes to the process for the year. March is where we have gotten in all the information from those ranking tools, and that'll be late March or April, like I said, and we will review what the national roll-up is. We'll do a deliberation of what we found, and we'll come together to come up with a strategy, and then the tribal group will make up the tribal budget for presentation to the Assistant Secretary. In July, our session that is coming up very shortly here in Fairbanks, we always go out to a tribal location in the summertime, and that session is good because we need to now look at what has come in congressional action-wise on what we have submitted as a budget. We can go over where our carryover balances are. Those types of things take place in that summer session. So it is another very important session where we get to look at things like how the House and Senate are looking at our proposed budget and what they're proposing to provide back to us in terms of that. Go ahead and switch. TIPIC recommendations to Indian Affairs. TIPIC serves as the intermediary between tribal nations and Indian Affairs. We work together each year to distribute the priority ranking tool. We get a lot of feedback here on the federal side from the TIPIC body and the members, as well as everyone that fills out the tool. They help us to get the word out. They help us to portray the importance of filling out the tool. They help us put the tool together. So as we go along, it's ever evolving. We change every year based on that feedback and try to make it as simple for tribes to use as possible. We know everybody's time is precious. We try to make sure that it covers everything that it needs to and is directing to getting us the information we need to make the most comprehensive budget. The most recent priority ranking tool was done differently to better represent what we need done as a whole, because we kept coming up with the same 10 priorities year after year, and we hear the same information over and over. There's 3 or 4 regions that have very important things to their locations only, but because the ranking is rolling up everybody across the board, those items get lost in the mix, and that was one item that we could never seem to address. We want to be able to reflect the importance of all the budget lines and not to the exclusion of, what's most important. So we did do some tweaking of the tool, and we've come up with a new strategy for that. What's on our next slide here, Tyler? Because I thought here we are. So the 2020 ranking tool asks tribal nations to prioritize just those top 10 budget lines, and you would have to look at all 104 lines. All the tribal rankings were consolidated and weighted to determine the overall top 10 tribal budget priorities. And that was a process we used for several years. Go ahead and go to the next one, Tyler. Based upon that, we came up with these. Basically, these were the same top 10 priorities that we kept running into. You'll actually see 11 here because detention and welfare assistance tied with the same weighting on the rankings. So we ended up with 11 as opposed to just eliminating one. But these same ones that you're looking at here every year came out as our top 10. So they would get all the focus. And in terms of what I'm looking at in a reduced budget, my advocacy to protect in a reduction scenario. And that was at the expense of the other programs, which we didn't like and was what we wanted to address. So if we move on, Tyler. In 2021, we changed the ranking tool so that we could get a better perspective on all of this. To ensure all programs can better be considered, we came up with 8 categories for ranking. We have 1 on strengthening tribal communities, 1 on natural resources, 1 on land and water management, 1 on public safety, 1 on economic development, education, construction, and then resource management construction. Within each of these 8 categories are all of those budget lines. and then those lines are then ranked within their own category. Now, each of the 104 programs can get ranked and receive consideration within their strategy category. That way, nobody gets left behind. And then once we come together, the TIPIC body looks at that, and we had them sit down and do, an exercise where we prioritize which categories were most important. And in that vein, what that allowed us to do is, with the next slide, Tyler, you can see here is natural resources. That's the way it rolled out within its category. So now there's natural resource programs that used to get lost in the mix. They never made it into the top 10. We now can actually take a look and see within that category of those programs which rolled out to be the most important to tribes. So now when I'm left to do my federal side of negotiating, I know that if I'm forced to take something away, I would hit the Fish and Wildlife program before I hit that Water Resources program. It helps us to figure out how to go forward with a budget that better supports the needs of the tribes. By not eliminating them completely from the picture, we can actually have some information on each of the categories. Go ahead, Tyler. So this is how we ended up doing this now. You can see we took that information from all of those roll-ups and all of those strategies. We sat down and we deliberated, and they prioritized the actual categories, with strengthening tribal communities falling in first. So those same ones that come in that top 10 are still there and getting top billing, but then we're followed up with public safety and justice, then education, then natural resources, economic development, and on down the line, as you can see in the chart here. But each of those categories receives some type of funding applied to them based upon that exercise. So nobody gets lost in the mix. All programs get looked at and considered in this tribal budget that was proposed, and we can see that it's important for everything. That way tribes aren't forced to just pick and choose 10 lines that are the most important to them. You can see in the top part of the box, they automatically gave funding to TPA, and that was across the board. 25% of funding off the top went to TPA lines. Then we stepped into providing funding to all of those categories. We think this is a much better way of approaching it. So nothing gets left behind. Everything gets some type of consideration and proposed within the budget. So we make a better statement to Congress, the department, OMB, that everything is important to Indian country, not just those top 10 items. So I'm really happy with the way this is going forward. Go ahead and do the next one. This is a pie that shows you the same type of information, so you can see how it divvies up the funding that this was an 8% increase scenario that the TIPIC group worked on, and you can see where each of the funding went to and where the bigger pieces of the pie went to the TPA and TPA, like right off the top. We have the inflationary money, and then you can see how it went around to whatever was the most important categories around. All right.
Thank you, Judy. This is Tyler with NCAI. I also wanted to mention while this slide was up that those programs that are TPA and TPA-like, all of them are also found in other categories. Less received, a few TPA-like, and lines that are administrative and executive direction. So those programs are receiving an increase as a TPA or TPA-like program, and then an additional increase in the subcategory. So those programs that are of high importance and recurring for TIBIC as high importance received additional increases.
All right. Okay, what does BIE do with the TIPIC tribal recommendations? Before we get into that, let's look at the timeline of the activity. This tags on to those timelines we've looked at, but kind of gives you a better picture of it. In the September and October timeframe, my shop here at Budget, we are busy updating the formulation guidance and the ranking tool based upon whatever feedback we're getting from TIBIC and tribes on how it worked out, from what worked, what didn't work. what do we still need to do better. So we're busy updating all of that. This year we'll be doing some serious updating for the BIE portion of this and how best to handle that to ensure the tribal schools get to put their feedback into ranking those education components. So we work on all of that, and by October 1, we have all of that up, ready, and ready to distribute. And we get that released out to the regions and the tribes, and we do a kickoff webinar for everybody to participate in. Every member of the TIBIC does get an invitation to that. November to January, we convene TIBIC for the first session of the fiscal year in November, and then the regions will hold all of their formulation meetings with tribes. They are instructed within the guidance to hold 2 sessions with tribes within their region, one to initially distribute the ranking tool and the guidance and get everybody started doing the tool, and they are requested to do a second follow-up session once they receive all the tribal rankings so that they can go over what has come in, how the weighting played out, and ensure that the tribes within the region are happy with how that weighting rolled out, or if there are any adjustments they want to make before final submission. So in February, the tribal rankings are all due. They come rolling up to us here in the department, and we have to take them and consolidate them into one national view. So we get each region, we put them together, everybody uses the same weighting factors, and then we apply that across the board, and we come up with a national roll-up. In March and April, sometime in there, we have that big session. We can bring TIPIC folks back in. We present those national ranking and roll-ups to the whole group. The group will do the deliberation like we did this time, which I thought was a lot of fun. Got everybody up and moving around, and we'll decide which of the categories are going to fall where. Let's see. The subcommittee will then meet following the TIPIC group coming up with their strategies and recommendations on how the subgroup should proceed. Then when TIPIC comes to a close, the subcommittee meets and will take those strategies and direction, and they will come up with the proposed tribal budget, present to the Assistant Secretary. In July, we have our final TIPIC session of the year. And like I said, that's where we'll come together and we will review what worked, what didn't work in the ranking and the formulation process, see if there's any new things we need to change for the guidance.
Why on earth you have the same freaking language? Oh, 1 second.
Oh, okay, that wasn't for us.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, review the status. We look at the status of the appropriations. Where are we in the process? What does the House mark look like? What does the Senate mark look like? We go over our obligations and outlays, what funding is available for carryover. We provide carryover reports, that type of stuff. So that's our timeline, a full year through for all 3 of the TIBIC sessions and the work that goes on in between. Okay. So, Indian Affairs consideration of TIPIC recommendations. Why is it that final President's budget request doesn't always reflect those TIPIC recommendations in that tribal budget proposal? We do our very best to incorporate those recommendations into our budget proposal. We advocate where we can, but in a lot of cases, we are acting on whatever the guidance that is proposed for us. We understand, and we don't force tribes, like Ron had mentioned, to do a decreased budget. It has been done in the past, but I know tribes do not want to do that, and I don't blame them for not wanting to do that. So we allow for you guys to do a true increased budget, whereas normally, especially under this administration, we are looking at a reduced budget because of the deficit area that Raina spoke of earlier. This budget is trying to, this president is trying to balance our budget. So we are in a deficit area where we're doing reduction scenarios right now. So the best we can do is work within the technical guidance that we have. We put together the best budget we can. We propose over targets to try and do the things that you want to do. But ultimately, we have to rely on what the department passes back to us at BIA, and then even when DOI goes forward, if we are fortunate enough to get the bulk of the funding, it still has to make it through OMB and the president, and as Raina laid out, they have to go through, and we're competing with every other agency at OMB to see who's going to get the biggest piece of the pie. So depending on what the president's priorities are, we get passed back from them. And those are the numbers that we're stuck with. So if the president says no, we go with what the president says. When guidance requires us to prepare the decrease, the best we can do, like I said, is I take what you guys have provided us as your priorities. And like I said, that helps us to decide if we have to decrease, where am I going to take that hit as opposed to something that I know is more important. So this new way of doing it gives me more information that I can use. So when I do have to cut, I can say, well, let me take where I hope it's going to hurt the least. You know, so it gives us a little more to work with. So what you're doing is important. Go ahead, Tyler. So why conduct TIPIC process? That's why. We still have the legal obligation to consult with you on the tribal budget. And we do need to know what the impacts are and what matters to tribes. It's important that tribes do come together and make your voices heard. And despite that they're not always there, you know, in our requests, your recommendations on what you do from TIPIC and those priority areas, they do go forward, you know, and you can see the difference in congressional increases and what they restore, you know, versus what they don't. Mandatory reductions to other priority areas, like I said, you know, if we have to take it, we can figure out where to take it that it doesn't hurt as much, those types of things. The long-term trajectory of the federal government's funding of the trust obligation does show that priority trends emerge from the TIPIC process. For instance, we know that road maintenance money went up because it's been a hot topic at TIPIC. So these things do happen. What happens at TIPIC does matter, and it does make a difference to the budget in the end. All right, go ahead, Tyler. So also, TIPIC's annual recommendations are not only helpful to us here, they are also a great tool for Congress and up on Capitol Hill. When we go to our hearings, those priority tables are held up in front of our face, and we are asked when we get up there, what was your consideration of these when you formulated this budget? So they have those up on the Hill. It's important that you have that united front that's coming from Indian country saying these are our priority areas. This is what's important to us. So Congress also has that to look at when they're looking at what they're going to restore. And that last bullet, bringing TIPIC's recommendations to Congress is more effective than anything that we do here. You know, we can't lobby, and like I said, we have many constraints on us on what we can do with our budget because we have to follow the technical guidance and protocol, the numbers we're given. You, as a united front, can take that tribal budget that's prepared, and you can go and you can talk on the Hill, and you can talk to Congress, and you can show them, you know, as a whole, this is what Indian country says, as opposed to everybody just going up and speaking their own divided issues. You're not going to get as far as you would with a consolidated front on the issue. So it is very important. What we do at TIPIC is used. It is seen by Congress. It is seen by the department. It is seen by OMB. So don't ever think that what we do there is not important and doesn't go forward just because it doesn't go in that green book. Believe me, if I didn't have it in my hand, my job would be a lot harder. I am fighting all the time, and then that sits in front of me, whether people like it or not, and I immediately turn and say, look, this is a priority to the tribe. Don't touch it. So it is used, trust me. And that is the end of mine, I do believe, Tyler, isn't it? This is where we get to questions and resources.
Yep, and this
right.
list of references, thank you, Janine. And this slide here is a list of references for folks to take a look at if you would like to learn a little bit more on your own about the budget process and kind of dive into some of these subject areas a little bit more. These are some great resources that you can access and kind of read up on some additional detail here. And with that, that is the end of our presentation, and I think we're going to go ahead and go into some Q&A that Tyler will moderate.
Thank you, Raina, and thank you very much, Janine. We did have one question come in during the TIPIC protocol presentation, specifically the number of voting members and what constitutes a quorum for the subcommittee. There was a recommendation that subcommittees be increased to 12 representatives in order to have representation from all BIA regions. I believe this is an item that would need to be deliberated by the full TIPIC body, but can be included for consideration in the Fairbanks TIPIC meeting agenda. At this time, are there any other questions or comments? Just another moment for those who have muted lines. And with that, thank you very much for joining us. Oh. Do any of the co-chairs or anything would like to say final remarks before we sign off?
I was just going to say,
go ahead. Go ahead, Rick.
This is Rick. I was just going to say good job to you guys for putting this together. And we really appreciate this process, and I hope folks that were on the line and got out of it what we intended.
Yeah,
yes, it was very helpful.
It was very helpful. It's a great overview. And I think that one of the things we probably should seriously consider is that we do it on a regular basis because we are consistently having new representatives from the different regions. So I think it's a good reminder for all those who feel like they know this process, but for those who don't, I think it helps everybody keep the big picture and the process in the perspective.
And Ron, this is Janine. We are going to do that. I know at the July session we do have this set up following the budget subcommittee. We have a block in the room where we're going to have this there for anyone that's there on the first day.
Great.
Thank you all. Are there any more questions at this time? Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and any questions or comments that are not addressed during this webinar, please feel free to email me at tscribner@ncai.org, and I'll be more than happy to take care of moving that question forward for a response as timely as possible. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys. Nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.